Hello, and welcome to the CDO Magazine interview series and CDO to CDO podcast. I'm Chris Nur, Chief Digital Officer of Synity, a world leader in enterprise data software, and we're partnering with CDO Magazine, MIT CDO IQ, and the International Society of Chief Data Officers to bring you this series of interviews with thought leaders in data and analytics. Today, it's my sincere pleasure to have as my guest Binu Varghese, Chief Data and Analytics Officer of the Carrier Corporation. Welcome, Binu. Great to have you on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to our discussion. So let me jump right in, and I want to start by going a little bit back into history. So you started off your career doing what we all used to call data warehousing, which it sounds kind of quaint and old-fashioned now, although in my experience, it's still a big factor in large enterprises. Can you give us a sense from kind of an evolutionary standpoint, data and analytics platforms, what have the major changes been and how well have those changes worked to deliver business value as the platforms have evolved from the kind of old time data warehouse days?
Absolutely, Chris. I think, first of all, I think, yes, data warehousing today does sound quaint or old-fashioned or dated and all of that. But the moment you add the word cloud in front of it, it becomes topical and here and now again, right? That said, just reflecting back on the different generations of data platforms, if we sort of think back, late 90s are when data warehousing sort of became mainstream. And so at that point, there were two kinds of platforms to build your data warehouses on top of. You could choose to build it on top of regular databases like Oracle and SQL Server, or you could build it on top of purpose-built data warehousing appliances like Teradata, Netezza, Vertica, etc. Now, the problem with building it on top of regular databases was that those databases were optimized primarily for transactional workloads and not for data warehousing and analytics kind of workloads. Right? And so inevitably, when data volumes reached a certain stage, there were performance challenges and it would get hard to manage. Right? And then on the other end of the spectrum, if you went with purpose-built data warehousing platforms like Teradata, they would take care of the performance aspect with these. Right? They're all MPP systems. And so theoretically, if you double the nodes on a Teradata system, you've doubled the performance. But then handling the cost part of it was the challenge with that, right? And so a Teradata node was typically pulling together compute and storage. And so even if you just wanted to scale storage, you would end up buying more expensive compute as well, right? And back in the day, platforms like Teradata didn't quite come cheap, right? So that was a challenge back then. Right?
Yeah, that's a good point, and maybe just to add on that, and it's funny because we did some research in preparation for this, and I wanted to actually go back into the history, but I had almost forgotten how bad the performance problems could be, and then you had this sort of not only did you have this cost performance trade-off, but then you got into this thing where it was like there was a gap between operational reporting and data warehousing, and like everyone kind of wanted to do some combination of both, but it never really worked it moved the needle a lot, but it never really met the aspirations. So that's really interesting to remember. Thank you.
Yeah, no, great comment. And I'm thinking back to those days as well, right? And then fast forward a few years, and then internet became mainstream, social media became mainstream, e-commerce platforms became mainstream. And so there was such an explosion of not just data volumes, but also variety of data in terms of semi-structured and unstructured data, and also the velocity at which the data was getting generated on all of these platforms, right? And so now the problem to solve moved away from cost and became more of how do you handle the volume, velocity, and variety of data, right? And then around that time, late 2008, early 2009 is when Hadoop and the Hadoop ecosystem sort of came into existence, right? And then the promise of the Hadoop ecosystem was solving for the three V's, right? You had frameworks like MapReduce that could handle large volumes. You had, because of the schema on read, kind of a philosophy, you could quickly ingest all kinds of data, semi-structured, structured, unstructured, onto the Hadoop platform. And then around, if I recall right, 2010, 2011, you also had components that could take care of the velocity piece, right? You had Kafka, Storm, all of those come in that could take care of real-time data use cases as well, right? Now, all of that was great, but the biggest challenge there was twofold. The first challenge was just setting up these platforms, configuring them. It was so complex and it was such a specialized task that there was just not enough of Hadoop admins to go around, right? And then the second challenge was that even if somehow you magically managed to set up a Hadoop environment, finding developers to write MapReduce code wasn't easy, right? And the rest of the Hadoop ecosystem was just about as complex, right? Then fast forward a few more years, I think the cloud data providers did a great job of solving one part of the complexity equation, right? So you had managed Hadoop instances on AWS, on Azure, on Google, right? So you have AWS EMR come in, HD Insights come in, etc., right? But then on the other end of the spectrum, you also had SQL on Hadoop platforms come in, right? So there was this realization that it's not enough to get data into Hadoop. You also have to be able to consume that data if you are to see any real value. And the business analysts, the data analysts, all of those folks who were familiar with SQL and SQL was their go-to tool couldn't hook up to Hadoop directly without a SQL-like interface, right? And that's when you saw platforms like Spark, Impala, you had Splice Machine, and a bunch of other platforms that could enable that kind of a functionality. And I think that in some way, and this was all 2012, 2013, I think that was breakthrough in terms of companies that had made big data investments, but could now start getting some real value out of it, because now business analysts could hook up with it, run their familiar SQL queries, get some answers for the business, right? Your familiar BI tools could hook up with it and then start getting some value, right? So that was around 2012. In my mind, that was like the third generation of data platforms, right? Or depending on how you count.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, sorry, Chris, go ahead.
No. So where I'm going with this, and I think this is all really valuable setup. So in my experience, what's ended up happening in large corporations like Carrier, and part of what I want to get to for our audience is, okay, as a data and analytics leader, like, how do we manage the strategy for this? So what I've observed is everything that you just said still exists. Right. So what's happened, like, there are breakthrough platforms and they are revolutionary, but almost nobody who had traditional EDW or enterprise warehousing has gotten rid of their high ceremony data warehouses that are used for things like statutory financial reporting. You get into a multinational that's, a portfolio company like yours, and my guess is, I don't know, but I'll ask you, you must have all of these things, right? They're all trying to coexist at the same time. So, from an organizational and technology strategy standpoint, this is like what, 5 years ago, everyone was talking about multimodal IT. This is like multimodal data and analytics, but on steroids. And it's almost like the more things come in, the more complicated our lives get. So one, do you kind of agree with that as a problem statement? And then two, like, what are some insights you'd share as, someone who's got accountability for these platforms? Like, how do you start untangling that and focusing on the things that are valuable without, without putting a stake in the heart of these, like, very expensive, capital intensive, ceremonious data warehouses that are still being used for, critical purposes, often with a regulatory reporting component? I know that was like 18 questions all at once, but that was sort of why I wanted to go through that setup, because I think this is a really interesting challenge that, it's every large enterprise I've worked in is facing a version of this. And I think you've got a unique perspective on it, with your deep knowledge of that whole history.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Chris. I think that's a fantastic question. Like you said, 18 questions in one. So
that's okay. If you get 3 or 4 answers, that'll be great.
Yes, I'll answer them one by one. Just for completing my thought on the platform evolution, I think the final stop on that journey was again what we today call cloud data warehouses, right? So we started with data warehouses and we ended with data warehouses, right? So I think after the whole uh,
True.
uh,
Yeah.
SQL on big data platforms, I think there was realization that SQL is not going anywhere. Right? If we have to have mainstream adoption, if we have to have enough skilled resources to be able to work the environment, then SQL has to be an integral part of it, right? And so around 2014, 2015, you had Snowflake and Redshift come into the market, right? Truly cloud data warehouses. Like Snowflake brought in the concept of separating storage and compute, which was absolutely revolutionary at that time, right? Being able to scale the component of your warehouse that you need to scale independent of the other was a paradigm shift from how we were thinking about it up until that point, right? And so again, fast forward a few years, if you look at what's the popular design pattern now, it is Hadoop, in some sense, has gone away or is not the most popular choice now. Right? Most organizations use their object store as the cloud object store as the data lake platform, if you will. Right? So if you AWS S3 or Azure Object Store, right, that's where they bring in all kinds of data, maintain as much history as they need, and then only the processed high value data gets pushed into your uh, cloud data warehouse. So that could be a Snowflake, that could be a Redshift, that could be a BigQuery, that could be a Azure Synapse Analytics, whatever it is. Right? And so that's broadly that's where we are in terms of platform evolution today. Now to your second question, right? Go to any large organization. Uh, Most of them would have gone through several cycles of IT
Yeah.
evolution.
Yeah.
There's regional ITs, and so there was a time when every part of IT was doing their own thing. There was no
Yeah.
single standard across the enterprise. Other companies grew through M&A, so they have a plethora of technologies and plethora of EDWs and data lakes and whatnot. And so uh, I think the prudent way to manage that is to firstly understand that there will always be multiple platforms, right? And that's part of the multimodal conversation, but that's also more importantly understanding that there are different businesses within a large company and each of them have differing priorities, right? So if I have to take our example, Carrier has three core businesses, right? We are in the HVAC business, refrigeration business, and fire and security business, right? Each of these are pretty large businesses of their own. They could be an independent company. I mean,
Yeah.
HVAC is about a $10 billion business. Refrigeration and fire and security are both between $4 and $5 billion, right? And so each of them legitimately have their own data and analytics needs, which could be very different from the rest of the organization, right? And so my data and analytics strategy is a two-level strategy. There's a BU level strategy, which is around maintaining a separate BU level data ecosystem for each of these areas, right? Because the BU level needs are much broader than the few common enterprise level needs we have, right? And then the common enterprise needs might be your headquarters finance wanting to look across all of the businesses and things of that nature, right? I mean, there are a few use cases like that as well, right? And so the way we are set up, I've got a SAP HANA ecosystem that supports our HVAC business. I've got a AWS plus Snowflake ecosystem that supports our refrigeration business. I've got a AWS plus Snowflake setup that supports our fire and security business. And then I've got AWS and Snowflake for supporting our enterprise needs, right? So four data ecosystems. And the way I make sure that this doesn't lead to problems is by ensuring that the source of the enterprise data ecosystem is the BU level data warehouses, right? And the advantage of doing that is that now whatever the BU level leaders are looking at in terms of numbers, those are the exact same numbers that are getting rolled up to the world headquarters, right? So there is no more ticking and tying needed, or different kinds of calculations happen, or different kinds of rounding happen, kind of problems, right? And so the BU level data warehouses, they are responsible for hooking up with all of the ERP systems and other systems at the BU level, right? And creating a single view for the BU. And then they're also responsible for feeding their BU specific information into the enterprise level view.
So this is really That's awesome. I love what you're saying, and I just want to play it back and make sure I understand correctly. So, what I'm hearing you say, in a sense, is that you've created an IT and a data strategy that is closely tied to the ownership and governance strategy, right? So, I'm the business unit leader. Ultimately, I own the numbers that I'm responsible for, and when that gets all rolled up, then nothing has changed. So there's not the sort of thing that happens, the back and forth that happens in corporate versus line of business disconnects, which is a pretty common problem.
Yeah, exactly.